Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we are getting even closer to opening day, and I have to tell you, with opening day and all of these other sports that are getting ready to start or are in the height of their season, I'm just incredibly thankful we have sports right now, because a year ago this time, there was no sports at all, so we've definitely come a long way without question, and I already know I'll be parked in front of my TV on opening day, taking notes and enjoying the immense amount of baseball. But jumping into today's episode, we've got another really good one, as I'll get into some young prospects and players that have stood out early on in spring training, another free agency division grading, and so much more. So let's get into it. And I'll first step right into some of the latest news going around the MLB, and a little update from spring training as well, and what all is going on down in Florida. And later, I'll share which young players and prospects that have been especially impressive early on in spring training and who could be making some early noise in their young careers. And then I'll get into which 3-game series in April and May you'll want to check out that could be great watches, and also previews to either division title races, wild card races, or even potential World Series previews. And make sure you stay right here with us for the final segment today, as I'll get into another division offseason grading of the teams and the entire division of the AL Central. It's going to be a really, really good one, a jam-packed show. But I want to first dive into a little contract update, as Kansas City Royals catcher Salvador Perez has signed a 4-year, $82 million extension that keeps him with the Royals all the way through till he is 35. And this is a big sign for the Royals, right? I've always been a big-time proponent and believer in Salvador Perez. Personally, I mean, he's the centerpiece of this team, right? I think that we can all agree to that. He's been around since their World Series runs. He's been around since their kind of rebuilding phase that they're in right now, and I think that they're slowly getting out of, to be honest with you. Not to mention, he's one of the best catchers that we've seen in the last 10 years, and I think a lot of people can make that argument. I think that you can put him up there, maybe not in the same tier as Yadier Molina, but he is really close. I mean, he is really, really close. This is actually the largest contract in Royals franchise history, and he'll be making $13 million this year, and he'll go all the way up till he goes into 2025, where he'll make $22 million, and then he'll have a $13.5 million club option in 2026. So he's going to be a Royal for quite some time, and I think that they're really happy about that. And this is the third highest contract for a catcher in history, trailing only JT Realmuto, who, as we all know, signed that huge contract himself recently, and then also Joe Mauer a few years ago with the Minnesota Twins. But regardless, I think that he's going to not only have a lot of success playing-wise, but he's also a mentor. He's a veteran. He's been around the block a couple times. And this is a really young team, and they've got a lot of really young pitchers that have a lot of potential. And everybody has always spoken very highly of his ability to have great pitcher-catcher relationships. All pitchers that have ever really had to work with him have said nothing but nice things about how he is very professional, how he's very particular, and just kind of very fine detailed in how he goes about approaching things, the pitch calling, the pitch sequence, everything that he does with the pitcher. Everybody has said that the chemistry between him and his pitchers has always been at a very high level. So I think having him around, being that mentor for these young pitchers, I think it's going to do wonders for their pitching rotation. He had a great year in 2020. I mean, he batted .333 with a .633 slugging percentage, and he was tied for the lead in catch. He's tied for the most home runs by a catcher in 2020 with 11. Him and JT Realmuto both belted 11 home runs. So a really big sign, really happy for Salvador Perez. I think he's somebody that we also kind of forget about because he is in Kansas City, and he's not really in a major market. And as a result, I don't know if we really pay as much attention to him as we should, because he is a very talented baseball player, and I think that he's going to continue to etch his name in baseball lore, if you will, especially in catcher lore, as one of the better catchers to have played this game. So congratulations to Mr. Perez. But I want to now just briefly touch on a little update involving the change in size and feel of the baseballs. I know I mentioned and discussed that a couple episodes ago and discussed what I felt was going to happen to the game and how that might have been received by the players. And again, there's already been some remarks made by players about the difference in the baseballs. And in all honesty, the things that I've read, and this was kind of an update during, or an update while I was reading The Athletic, an everyday individual is not going to notice any difference. Somebody that has not really been picking up a baseball every single day, numerous times throughout the day, they're not going to feel any sort of difference. They're not going to feel a size change or a weight change or anything. But pitchers have already made comments early on about how the laces seem to be much thicker than they usually are, and the ball seems to be much squishier as well, near the seams as well. So it might give them a little bit better grip. It'll allow, and some will think that it's going to increase the spin rate for some pitchers that already have really good off-speed pitches and have great breaking balls. They might have really good seasons this year because it might be a lot easier for them to, A, grip the ball that way, but B, also the sheer trajectory that will come out. It's going to come out completely different. And so it might allow pitchers to kind of come back and reign over baseball, as opposed to how it's been the last 2 years, where hitters seem to have ruled baseball for the most part due to all the home runs and all the massive amount of power and offensive statistics that have really ballooned, I would say. And then also, just getting kind of an insight from a particular player, Blake Snell has already noticed that the ball does not carry as much on fly balls. So again, it's going to be a lot harder for some of these big-time power hitters and guys that haven't even been hitting the ball that far but have been pretty consistent with how often they're hitting home runs. That's going to be a big change for them. They're not going to be able to give it, or they're not going to be able to give it the lift that they're used to giving the ball when they swing and hit. And as a result, it's definitely going to, I think, backfire a little bit. I think that some guys are definitely going to see a digression in their numbers. They're going to see a setback a little bit. I don't think it'll be anything drastic, but this is going to be a year of the pitcher, I think. I think we're going to see pitchers really start to expand their repertoire pitching-wise. And guys like Trevor Bauer, who's known for having a really, really good spin rate, he's going to be one of those guys that's going to benefit the most from this. So I do think that this change now kind of puts the ball back in play for pitchers as opposed to having the ball in play for hitters, and really kind of the advantage being in the hitter's favor. Now I think it's a little bit in the pitcher's side. So it'll be very interesting, but also just kind of intriguing to see the early reports and the early remarks about the changing of baseballs and how the players are starting to respond to it this early on in the season. I mean, we haven't even gotten to opening day quite yet, and guys are already making comments about it. So I can only imagine what's going to be said come June, July, and August as we really get into the thick of the season. Are there going to be more comments? Are there going to be more concerns? Are there going to be more kind of high praise, positive remarks about it? And are players, both hitters and pitchers, going to like the changing in baseballs? It'll be interesting. This is going to be a very, very interesting season, to say the least, especially with the changing in baseballs. But I'm going to get out of that because I want to get into this story that, again, I found in The Athletic. And I mention this all the time. If you are not, or if you are subscribed to The Athletic, I would check out as much as you can because they've got great, great stuff on there. And I'm subscribed. If I'm not mistaken, it's a pretty cheap subscription. So be sure to check out The Athletic. Really, really good stuff there. But this is a story that it's kind of an inside look as to what all went wrong in Colorado that forced Nolan Arenado to request a trade, as we know, this offseason. Then he wound up getting dealt over to the St. Louis Cardinals. And then also really what kind of the downfall and really the relationship has been, not only between himself and the Rockies, but other previous big-time players in the Rockies, and also just general employees in the Rockies organization. So going to set the story here a little bit. Jeff Bridich is going to be the main guy in this, and Dick Monfort. So Bridich is the GM of the Rockies, and Monfort is the owner. And they're very, very important in this because, in all honesty, Bridich, he's gotten some very high remarks and some very low remarks. He's gotten a lot of a mixed review, if you will, in terms of how he's viewed amongst other baseball executives, how people within the organization view him, so on and so forth. So setting the scene, going back a couple years ago, the Rockies, they were coming off a year where they lost DJ LeMahieu, as we may or may not know, who used to play for the Rockies, lost him in free agency, and they wanted to build around Nolan Arenado. So they signed him to an 8-year, $260 million deal, a huge deal, and quite frankly, something that I think is very deserving. He's a very good baseball player. Again, he just is coming off a season where he won his 8th straight Gold Glove. He's a 5-time All-Star. The guy's put up pretty astronomical numbers over the last few years. Now, what happened was things started to go really south really quickly, and while reading this story, a lot of people in the organization even mentioned and commented on how quickly things just kind of fell apart, if you will, and they really, really just came crashing down. Bridich wasn't able to build a winning roster, and that's what really reeled in Nolan Arenado. Was they sat down with Nolan Arenado, they said, hey, we're going to build around you, we're going to build a winning team, we're going to build a winning roster. And Arenado was even quoted as saying, hey, you're going to give me $260 million. That's not a figure that you just give to a player just because you want to. You're doing that because you're saying, hey, we're trying to win around you. We're going to keep you here, but you also have to uphold your end of the bargain and play that high of a level of baseball. And he's capable of it, clearly. And then in kind of what happened there was Bridich, again, was not able to bring in guys. A lot of players that he brought in were not very successful. In the 6 years of him being the GM, he's committed over $300 million to free agents. $300 million. And out of all of those free agents, their combined WAR has been a minus 3.4. So he has pretty much just wasted $300 million on players that have not been able to produce at all. And so you can kind of see the growing frustration that Arenado had. And then really things have started to come into question about management outside of the relationships that Bridich has had with star players, but also how Monfort runs the team. A lot of people had mentioned that they don't know if he's really fit to be an owner of a baseball team. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he inherited a lot of money. He did build the Rockies into a very profitable franchise. I believe he invested about $20 million into the Rockies to start back in the 90s when they became a team, and now their value is well over $1 billion, might be over $2 billion. So he's had a pretty solid return on his investment, if you ask me. But some of the things that have kind of come out about Bridich is that this is a gentleman who probably should not be the general manager of this team. And a lot of people think that the decision-making is kind of questionable. And there's also been some executives that have kind of called Monfort and Bridich kind of these wannabe Theo Epsteins, thinking that they can build these really successful teams, and they haven't been able to show that. And as a result, that's really kind of been a struggling thing for them. And they've been kind of, I would say, on the latter end of success the last couple of years. I mean, you look at some of the players that they've had on their teams and that they currently have, and it kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit and say, how in the world have they not been able to win? How have they not been able to even come close to, competing for a playoff spot, maybe a wild card spot here and there, but that was about it. And there were a lot of moves that actually could have been made by this team. And if you kind of look back at it, it's shocking that they didn't make it. They could have made a deal where they would have traded for Real Muto when he was with the Marlins still. Bridich did not want to let go of Brendan Rodgers for whatever reason. And as a result, Real Muto got traded over to the Phillies. And that's what kind of, involved the Sixto Sanchez exchange and having him come to Miami and whatnot. The Rockies really missed out on an opportunity, if you ask me. And then kind of internally, and you kind of look at what this, ownership and what this management is kind of like right now. And as a result, you look and see, there's some employees that are within the organization saying that, honestly, the communication is pretty bad. Bridich is not a very outspoken or really just not a very communicative individual amongst his other employees and people that work for him and so on and so forth. And so as a result, it's made things a little bit challenging internally. And a lot of, employees have even said that there is a lack of talent evaluation, which has been a really, really big complaint. And even players have said that. There's some players, for example, Charlie Blackmon was so frustrated with the lack of hitting plan and kind of statistical analytics because their analytics department is one of the worst in all of baseball. I mean, they literally just put it together about a year or two ago, and as of right now, there's only about 2 people in the department. So there's literally no analytics, and as we know, baseball has become a very analytics-driven sport. And it's really a sport that relies on numbers, relies on statistics, and as a result, players are not having access to that. And there have been players that have been outspoken and have complained about that. And Charlie Blackmon put together his own hitting plan that was so well received that the Rockies wound up using it not only on their major league team, but also throughout their minor league systems. So that should tell you something. If the players are having to do that, and again, that's probably not in their job description, right? They're players. They go out and play. They're not having to write up these workouts and write up these hitting plans. I mean, that's kind of insane to think about. And the Rockies also did a lot of unconventional things during the pandemic. They never let go of any employees. They didn't furlough anybody. They kept everybody on board. They didn't bring back any of the seasonal workers. So what they did was they had people in the front office take other duties. So there were guys that were, working in the front office. They were usually executives or doing something during the day. And then they would go and work in the clubhouse. They would go and be, equipment managers, or they'll go and be grounds crew members during the games or whatever. So they're kind of a very unconventional way of running a team, if you ask me. And I do wonder if that had any sort of implication into what kind of went on with Arenado, and if he kind of saw that as a sign of like, hey, if they're doing this, I can only imagine what they're, wanting to do, with me. Are they going to have me now start to pitch or whatever? They're having these people that are going outside of their job description. Am I going to have the same thing? And not to mention, they're not building a winning team around me. So I can definitely see Arenado's growing frustration. What is mind-boggling to me is that it just happened so quickly. And it was almost like it came crashing down out of just nowhere. And it was kind of insane when I was reading this story, is just how quickly people discussed how rapid the decline was, and kind of the deterioration of the relationship between Arenado and Bridich and Monfort. And as a result, even some pitchers have had to make their own pitching plans. And former players have been very outspoken about how they don't feel like they're getting the adequate improvements that they need, and adequate, I would say, also resources and tools to make sure that they are able to prepare properly, to improve properly, to work properly. And then not to mention, this is not the first time where a superstar player on the Rockies winds up having a very poor relationship. Look at Troy Tulowitzky. Troy Tulowitzky in the story went so far as saying that he would not even talk to Bridich these days. And there were some other players that said that Bridich was not a very outspoken, not a very conversational individual. And some players got so frustrated trying to talk to him, and he would just ignore them or just pass on by like he didn't even know them, that some of the players just wound up kind of ignoring him themselves. And that's just right there. That's not good internal relationships. That's not good internal communication. And if you want an organization to work, if you want your players to be happy, it has to start from the top and work its way down. If players are starting to see that there's a lack of communication, there's a lack of desire, this, that, and the third, they're not going to have a desire to want to play or win. And what is mind-boggling is that the Rockies, in the last couple of years, they've consistently been in the top 10 in attendance. And they have a solid following. They have a decent fan base, but they just cannot win. And it is just so mind-boggling to me that they haven't been able to figure it out. But hopefully one of these days they're able to, because if not, they're going to have themselves a lot of issues on their hands, because it does not sound like Bridich is the individual who is very, I would say, up to speed on how to rebuild a team. Again, this article was saying that him and Monfort are these wannabe Theo Epsteins. So I can only imagine when all of these star players like Trevor Story, whose contract will be up at the end of this season, and he's going to be a free agent. Is he going to re-sign? Is he going to come back? Charlie Blackmon, he's going to be a free agent in a couple years. They have good players, and it just has always been kind of puzzling to me why they haven't been able to put together winning teams. But all in all, I think you can see why Arenado wanted this trade. And I think what's so mind-boggling is that we just saw it as such a quick change in perception, quick change in mind by him. Again, he signed this extension in 2019, and it's 2021 now. So in about a year and a half, 2 years or so, things just completely came crashing down in Colorado. So we'll have to see, and we'll have to monitor this situation with Colorado moving forward, and if there's going to be any other superstar players that are going to become disgruntled with the ownership and the management. But I want to just finish things out with a little update from spring training and discuss some players and teams that have been starting to play really well and continue to play well down in Florida. First things first, I have to discuss Josh Rojas. He's been playing really, really well. I've read a lot of really good things about him, how Everybody has been very pleased that they were able to get him in Arizona, came over in the Zach Greinke trade, and he's been a nice piece for them, batting .327 right now, 3 homers, 8 RBIs, a .911 OPS. So he's got some power in his bat, too, which is something that I wouldn't say that many players, especially shortstops, have all the time. I will say that more shortstops are starting to be more power-oriented, but it's good to see that Rojas is kind of emerging quickly through the Arizona Diamondbacks organization and their franchise. And also have to give a lot of respect to Eloy Jimenez right now, batting .304, 2 homers, 10 RBIs. He seems to be back to where he left off last year. And this White Sox team, I mean, if they can have everybody playing on the same page this year, and I know a lot of people, the off-season headlines have been, can Tony La Russa mesh with this young group of guys? From what I've seen, what I've read, Tim Anderson is, one example. I mean, he's come out and said and been quoted by saying that he really seems to be on the same page with Tony La Russa. He likes where he's going. So if a guy that, has been kind of around the team for the last couple years, and I would say is a little bit of an older, player, and he's been around a little bit longer, if he's kind of giving the A-OK, then I feel like things are going to be all right. I can imagine that the other relationships that La Russa has with the other players is probably also similar. So it's going to be interesting because they've got a lot of talent. They have a ton of talent, and it's just a matter of them being able to put it together. And I think that they could do that this year. I really do. And then another guy for the Padres, Jorge Mateo, he's been playing great. .903 OPS, batting .333 right now, a 25-year-old shortstop. I mean, the Padres, it just seems like they've really hit the nail on the head, and they've just struck gold with all of these players they have. They go out and trade and acquire all these players. They've got all these players that are kind of just sitting and waiting for their turn in the farm system and in their organization. They can eventually become, the next big thing in the organization, or they get traded if they become really good players. I think the Padres are in a really good spot for the next couple seasons, if you ask me. But then another guy who I've mentioned before who continues to play well, Michael Chavis. I think he's going to be really good this year. Batting .295, 6 homers, 10 RBIs, and there's a lot of discussion in the Red Sox organization as to who's going to be the first baseman for the Red Sox, and a lot of people feel that it should be Chavis. I mean, I think it should be. The guy's got a pretty solid fielding percentage. He's played in the most amount of games at first base out of all of the players on the Red Sox who are listed as first baseman. And the guy's hitting well, so why not give it to him? If he's hitting that well, I would go ahead and just let him roll with it. I think that he could be somebody that emerges as a big-time player for the Red Sox and somebody that could actually help them get over kind of this hump that they're in right now because they can't seem to figure it out. They didn't figure it out last year. And, I mean, they have been off to a pretty solid start, and it kicks me into talking about which teams have been doing well. The Red Sox 12-8 right now. Mets 10-8. But again, if the Red Sox can continue to play like they're normally playing and what they're used to playing, they can get Chris Sale back, get him healthy, get Eduardo Rodriguez back, and get him healthy. If they can get these guys healthy and they can get Devers back to how he was hitting in 2019, if they can get J.D. Martinez back to his 2018, 2019 self, Xander Bogaerts, if he can build off of the year he had a year ago, this is going to still be a good team. I think that we forgot about them a little bit because they were so bad last year. But you can't forget about the Red Sox. They're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. But some other teams that have been doing well, Yankees 13-7. Blue Jays have been on a tear lately, 13-8. They're 7-3 in their last 10. And again, I mean, right now in the Grapefruit League, the first 4 teams, 3 of them are in the AL East. So we might have a tighter race in the AL East than many think because of, again, how well the Red Sox have been playing, and then obviously the Blue Jays and the Yankees and with their acquisitions in the offseason. But then going through some other teams, the Pirates have actually been playing pretty well themselves, 11-10. The Phillies, they're 10-11 right now. Then going down to the Cactus League, the Royals, again, still really rolling, 13-6. Cubs are 12-7. Brewers are 12-9. Rangers are 11-8. So there's some teams that have been playing pretty solid, but we'll have to see if they can really translate that into the regular season because, again, folks, we're only under 2 weeks, a matter of days before we're back into baseball season, and it's opening day. So I'm getting really excited, but just kind of running through some things and some updates in spring training and giving you some names and teams to really pay attention to as we move into the first few weeks of the season. But folks, that'll do it for us in this first segment, but don't go anywhere, because when I get back from the commercial break, I'll get right into discussing which young players and prospects have been especially impressive down in Florida during this year's spring training. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all. And in our first segment, I got into some of the latest news going around the MLB and also a little update from the spring training down in Florida. But make sure you stay right here with me on the GSMC Baseball Podcast for the final segment today, where I'll get into another offseason grading of the AL Central and discuss what my offseason grades would be for the teams in the division, but also the division as a whole. I want to now get into some of the young prospects and players that have really jumped out early on down in Florida and who we may see and hear more from as the season marches on. So getting into the first player that's really caught my eye, Ty France from the Seattle Mariners. Right now, he's batting .417. Many feel that he's been the best hitter for Seattle for the duration of this spring training, and he's really, again, shown it early on. And I know I'm recording this on March 24th, so as of today, he's batting .417. And I think that is a great sign for this young Mariners team that they know that they can get help from other people besides Kyle Lewis. And I think a lot of people right now are saying, okay, they've got Kyle Seager, but how much longer is he going to be there? Is he going to be there for an extended period of time? Are they going to eventually move him and trade him? Is he going to go in free agency? I don't know if Kyle Seager is necessarily going to be the guy that takes them to the promised land. Kyle Lewis seems to be the future franchise player of the Mariners. If they can get other guys around him, like Ty France, they need to get Evan White back and heading into a solid form. Because, again, if he's not hitting, he's a great fielder, wins a Gold Glove at first base, he's a great fielder, but hitting-wise, he was not good at all last year. And he's a former first-round pick, and if they can get him hitting, I think that they can really move things around well amongst those three guys, and not to mention, this is one of the youngest teams in baseball. So they have a lot of time ahead of them to really kind of get going and really get a feel for themselves. And France, he hasn't had many reps in the field. And some do feel that he could be the everyday third baseman if Kyle Seager were to be traded. So that is something to watch. What's going to happen at third base in Seattle? Now, he was with the Padres before he came to Seattle, and he batted very well last year between the Seattle and San Diego. He played in 43 games, and he had a .305 batting average. So somebody that definitely proved themselves. I know it's a very small sample size, but no matter what, if he's still able to produce at that level and he's carrying that over into the spring training early on, I think that's a good sign if you're the Mariners. His numbers did dip just slightly when he was traded from San Diego to Seattle, but they were still fairly consistent. I think it was a matter of, just a couple, tenths of a percentage point. I think he batted .309 when he was San Diego, and he came over to Seattle and batted .302. So you tell me how big of a difference that is. That doesn't sound like a huge difference to me. And he could be, again, one of those young pieces that they have to build around. I think that the fielding does need to step up a little bit. That's going to come in time with more reps. That's another thing to factor in. People do think he needs to step up the fielding. Obviously, he had 3 defensive runs saved per year on average, so he is in the positive in that. But he hasn't had many reps, so you can only go so far as to saying, hey, he needs to get better at third base. Well, he hasn't really had as many reps as one would want. So I would say that if he can continue to work at that position, they can definitely find an everyday third baseman for them. He's got 5 homers and 10 RBIs down in Florida as of, again, today on March 24th. So this might be the beginning of something very special in Seattle, and I'm really excited to see what France is going to do in Seattle. But getting in my next player, Josh Rojas, I know I briefly mentioned him in the first segment. He's starting to blossom, and it's an incredible sign for the Diamondbacks. He's been on a tear during spring training. Reached base in 13 straight games down in Florida, batting .340 currently with 3 homers and 8 RBIs. He's only appeared in 58 career games. So again, very similar to France, and this is a young player/prospect list. This is a young player/prospect kind of a ranking, if you will. Not ranking, but you know what I mean. These are guys that are going to eventually be really, really good, who've started to kind of show signs of that potential early on in spring training, and he's only had a 206 average career-wise. But 2020, he was hampered by a back injury, so he seems to be back into full health here in Florida, and he came over in that Greinke trade when Greinke went from Arizona to Houston, and so Rojas came over from Houston, and I think the Diamondbacks got a steal. I think that they got a huge, huge pick for him. I think that he's definitely going to be a big-time player for them. He's got a great swing. He hits with a ton of power, very quick, compact swing, nothing crazy. The one thing about Ty France, I would say, just kind of going back to him, his swing's a little long. It takes a little bit of time for him to get around to the ball. So if he can shorten that, compact that a little bit, I think it's going to be even scarier with what he can do at the plate. But Rojas, I mean, he can be an everyday infielder. They actually said that he can play a multitude of infield positions. He can play third, he can play short, he can play second. So he's somebody that they can move around. He can clearly hit. And so I think that he's going to be somebody that they're going to be really happy that they were able to acquire in that trade. And the Diamondbacks, they might slowly be able to build themselves up into a winning team. I do think that they are still a couple years away from that, but it is a good sign early on. They've got players like Rojas who are starting to bud early on in their career. Next guy I want to talk about, who already exploded onto the scene last year, and I think it was just a scratching of the surface for him, Alec Baum for the Phillies. I mean, he's been on a tear, very similar to last year. I mean, he was one of the top rookies in baseball. He was actually an NL Rookie of the Year finalist before losing to Devin Williams, who from the Brewers had an insane season as a rookie. He's batting .324 currently in spring training. He's got 1 home run, 5 RBIs, a .910 OPS, but virtually similar numbers to what he had in 2020. Batted .338 with 4 homers and 23 RBIs. He had a .136 OPS plus. So this is a player that I think is really going to become a household name eventually. I mean, him and Rhys Hoskins. The Phillies have a better team than I think a lot of people realize, and I know that it's hard to realize because they aren't able to really put together winning records, and they haven't been to the playoffs in 9-10 years. But I think what they can do is if they've got these young players mixed in with some veteran leadership and veteran talent like Bryce Harper and Didi Gregorius and JT Realmuto, you mix that in with Alec Baum and Rhys Hoskins, you've got a pretty solid team. You've got a really solid team if you ask me. He's a very, very composed young player too, and Joe Girardi has raved about Baum's ability to just kind of not feed into pressure. He said many times last year he had some really, really big at-bats. He said he had some huge, huge plays at the plate that a lot of young players probably would have crumbled in that situation. And he said he was cool, calm, and collected, and he just went about his business. And so I think that's another thing to really pay attention to, being that young and being that composed. I think it's only a recipe for him to just continue to get more, even better as the years go on. And I think he's going to be a big part of this Phillies future. So I'm excited to see where Baum goes and what he does in Philadelphia. But then getting into my next player, Akil Badu from the Tigers. He has been on a tear himself, playing great baseball. Another guy with a great swing. I mean, similar to Rojas, both have very solid, aggressive, strong swings, short, compact swings, and they just are smooth. And they make a lot of hard contact, a lot of barrel contact with the ball, so that's a great sign that you want to see. Batting .344 in spring training right now. He was actually the Tigers' Rule 5 draft pick from when they took him from the Twins, and he's been on a roll ever since spring training has started. He's only 22 also. I mean, he's one of the youngest guys that I have mentioned so far. And so if you've got a guy that's, again, 22 to 25 right now, putting up numbers like that, showing signs of potential like that, a great sign moving forward. He was hampered by some injuries. Last year, he was kind of nursing some injuries here and there, but it was good to see Badu back in kind of a full force effect and really just playing at a high level. I mean, he's got 4 home runs so far and 9 RBIs and over a 1,200 OPS. So, I mean, I think there's only one way from there, and that's up for this player. I mean, Badu is a great player. He hasn't had much time in the minors. That's kind of one of the caveats. Now, we have seen players who have come from single A, low A ball, all the way to the majors and have no problem adjusting. Players like Sixto Sanchez, who virtually had little to no time in the minors, gets called up to the majors, and he had a really, really good season last year as a rookie. So it is possible to make that big jump. I mean, he hasn't really seen much time after and outside of high A ball, and so if you're not playing much outside of high A ball and you're going right to the majors, I would say 9 times out of 10, those players would be kind of thrown off at first and really have to adjust. But Badu has done a nice job. And he's also, and this is kind of what's unique about him, is he's known for the defense and the base running. That's what he's really been known for. And so showing these signs of hitting this early on in spring training, this early on in his career, I think it also shows that he can kind of go against what everyone knows him for, and he can build into his own player. And I think that's what he's starting to do. Again, a great quick swing with a lot of power, and I think he's going to be great in Detroit. I think he's going to be a player that they're going to be very pleased to have for years to come, quite frankly. And I'm excited to see what he does in Detroit as well. Another player now in Cincinnati with the Reds, Jonathan India. He's been playing great as well, batting .344 himself. He owns an 1,100 OPS. He's got 2 homers and 5 RBIs down in Florida right now. And he's been playing really, really well. I mean, he started to kind of, I think, make the Reds rethink their lineup a little bit. Going into spring training, he wasn't really on anybody's radar in the Reds organization. He's played so well that now they have to figure out what they're going to do with the infield because they've got numerous third basemen that they can move around, and that's the problem. India was drafted as a third baseman, and he's had some reps over there. You have Eugenio Suarez already over there at third. You've got guys like Mike Moustakas, who plays third. You have guys like Nick Castellanos, who also has played third in previous seasons. Nick Senzel was drafted as a third baseman. So right there, that's 4 or 5 different guys that they're going to have to figure out what they're going to do at third base. Now, I think that they can move some guys in the infield kind of around because Moustakas, he doesn't have to play third. He played a little bit of second earlier in his career. Castellanos, I kind of see him more as an outfielder. I mean, maybe you stick him at third still, but more as an outfielder. And I just think that India he's made such a big case that if he's not going to play third and they have to keep Suarez. However, I will say, Suarez, although we all see him as a third baseman, he's lost a lot of weight. A lot of people in the Reds camp have said that his quickness has just skyrocketed. And as a result, you could maybe move him to short. You move him to short, a little bit of a position where you have to be a little bit quicker, a little bit better laterally, going left and right. I mean, shredding down some weight has definitely helped him out in that. Then you can put India at third and you can put Moustakas at second. I think that you've got a pretty solid infield from what India has shown early on. And again, he keeps his hand. What I like about his swing, and I've noticed this amongst a lot of guys that have these really quick swings and they're able to get their hands around very, very rapidly. He keeps his hands pretty close to his body. And he kind of just waits and waits. He sees the pitch, he loads, locks, and goes. And that's exactly what you want to see, I think, from a guy that has a lot of power. I mean, he generates a lot of power in that swing. And I think that's why he's able to get his hands around so quickly. He's not really moving his hands so far back and starting them so far, back behind his head or up towards his shoulder, where normally a lot of players are taught, keeping them close down into kind of his chest area, gets it loaded, and then goes. And that's why I think he's been so successful. And I think he's going to wind up being a pleasant surprise for them. I really do. I think that they're going to be very, very pleased that they are able to have him around, not only because of his, fielding ability, but his hitting ability. And I think that's going to be a piece that the Reds might really try and develop as time goes on. Because this is a team that, let's face it, they had one of the saddest seasons last year with all of the offseason moves that they made, with all of the offseason hype that they had going into the season. I mean, I for one, was sold on the hype, right? I mean, I thought they were going to be at least second, if not first place in the NL Central. They limp their way into the playoffs as a wild card team, and they just barely get there. And they lose to the Braves in a 3-game series, and that's all she wrote. So, I mean, I thought it was kind of a disappointing season for the Reds, and so maybe they can try and rebound and build on that this year. But getting to my last 2 players, first one, pitcher from the Marlins, Sandy Alcantara. And now a lot of things that I was reading, a lot of reports about him, they say that he's kind of the ace for the Marlins. I do see that, but with how well Sixto Sanchez pitched last year and what he showed me, I don't know. I think Sanchez could eventually become the ace. But getting into Alcantara, he's been on fire in spring training. I mean, he's been mowing batters over in spring training with a spring training high 24 Ks. He's got a 1.04 ERA. He's been virtually untouchable. And he's got a 1.2 whip. So he's, again, showing a sign of being able to keep guys off the base path. And I know a lot of pitchers are great with that. Kenta Maeda comes to mind, who's actually leading the spring training last time I checked in whip at a 0.42. And somebody who led all of baseball last year in that category, Kenta Maeda, if you're able to keep guys off the base path, whether it's, with infield singles or just hits in general or walks or whatever, and you're able to keep everybody off, that makes things so much easier for your defense, A, and B, it makes things a lot easier for your offense, too. They can give you that run support and feel very confident knowing that when they go out and play defense, they've got a great pitcher on the mound that's going to keep the ball out of play, and they're going to be able to move in and out of innings quickly. But Alcantara, I think he's got one thing that kind of, one clink in his armor. He has a tendency to walk guys. He's got a pretty high walk rate, and as a result, I do kind of worry about that if he can, potentially get out of hand one game and he surrenders one too many walks. But I will say the Mets are really emphasizing this strong, young pitching core. And I think the Marlins are wise to build around that. They've got some really good pitchers that I could see having some really good careers ahead of them. And if they continue to kind of build around that pitching slowly but surely, I think that they've done a wonderful job so far. And I know they're probably not going to really compete in the NL East because let's face it, right? The NL East is just stacked this year. I don't think that the Marlins can really do anything. If they were, I would be very shocked. I would be very impressed as well. But I just don't see that happening. Now, Alcantara, he was an all-star in 2019. He was out for most of 2020 because of the Marlins COVID outbreak. He actually wound up getting COVID himself, and it took about a month for him to get back into the swing of things due to, again, coming out of quarantine, getting back into shape, getting his arm ready to be kind of that everyday starter when he can be ready. But he owns a 3.7 ERA career-wise, and he had a career high in Ks in 2019 with 151. So you kind of erase that 2020 season that I think a lot of players want to erase. He's on a pretty high momentum wave, if you ask me. I think he's really riding this momentum wave well into the season, and he's got a great four-seam fastball that's really seen an uptick in velocity. From 2018 to 2020, it has gone up from 95.5 miles an hour on average in 2018 to now 96.8, so just under 97 miles an hour in 2020. So again, a guy that's got a lot of zip on his fastball, a two-pitch arsenal with a sinker and a four-seam fastball. He actually uses those two pitches 59.7% of the time of his pitches, so just about 60% of the time. So at 6 out of every 10 pitches, he's either throwing a sinker or he's throwing a fastball, one of the two. And it seems to be very effective for him. And I think that he can lead this young Miami Marlins pitching core. And who knows, he could become kind of the namesake and really the main staple of this Marlins franchise for the future. And I think that this is going to be an exciting team to watch down the road. Right now, maybe not so much, but down the road, I could definitely see that. Last player, and I mentioned him in my first segment, I'll continue to mention him until the Red Sox can hear me and they put him at first base. Michael Chavis. I am a huge fan of Chavis. Again, he's batting near 300, right around 295, 300 for most of spring training. He's right around there now. He's made a great case for being the first baseman on opening day. And again, he's had 73 games at first base in his career. He owns a .981 fielding percentage. That's the most games on the Red Sox roster for any player that has played at first base. So he's logged in the most time at first. Why not just give him the keys to the first base position, right? And he's batted well in his career, too. For the most part, I would say. Early on, maybe a 241 average, not great, but he shows potential, and he's been playing well early on. And in his rookie year in 2019, that's when he really showed the potential. 95 games, not a great average with 254, but he belted 18 home runs and 58 RBIs, which were both the most in those respective categories, 18 homers and 58 RBIs, the most in those categories by a Red Sox rookie since 1987. So I think that the Red Sox might be potentially having a secret weapon on their hands, and it's Chavis. And I think that he's got, again, a great, powerful swing from the right side of the plate. He can put the ball all over the field. I think this would be a big missed opportunity for the Red Sox if they don't stick him at first on opening day. So hopefully they do. But just running through a couple guys to pay close attention to going into this season, right? We might see Josh Rojas play shortstop or second for the Diamondbacks. We might see Ty France be the opening day starter at third base for the Mariners. We could see Sandy Alcantara, who will most likely be the opening day starter for the Marlins, be the opening day starter for the Marlins. So I think we could see a lot of these players slowly making their way through the ranks of their respective franchises and their respective organizations. And I think we're going to start hearing their names much more often, in my opinion. So I'm excited for this year and all the young talent that's coming up through the league. But, folks, that's going to close things out for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in, as always. Now, coming up after the commercial, I'll discuss the 3-game series to pay close attention to come April and May and in the early part of the season, and which matchups will become very interesting to watch early on and later on in the season as well. It's been a lot of fun so far, folks, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenour again. And in the previous segment, I got into which players that have been playing well in spring training you'll need to pay close attention to during the season, and that could be major impact players during the season for their respective teams. But I want to now get into some of the 3-game series you should pay very close attention to during the early months of the season, because they could become division races down the stretch this year, but also could be potential matchups in the playoffs later on in this upcoming fall. Now, I'm going to just run through a couple of them and just mention briefly why I would say pay close attention to these, due to the fact that, again, these could be previews to tight races that are going to happen later on in the season, and especially as we get into the playoffs much further down the road. So the first one I want to get into, Yankees and Rays in a 3-game stand, April 9th to April 11th. Again, this is kind of a preview, I think, for the fight for the AL East potentially, if the Rays are able to rebound and build off the year they had last year. Again, we only saw them in a 60-game sample. They came out really strong, 40-20, but we don't really know what they would have been like after 60 games. And this is kind of a rematch of the last year's ALDS, where the Rays did beat the Yankees. But let's face it, I think that this Yankees team, out of 10 times, if they had to get into a series with the Rays, I think 8 or 9 times out of 10, they are going to win that series. And I think last year was just that one time that they lost. I mean, if you look on paper, the Yankees are a more talented team across the board. Hitting, I mean, everything. And especially this year with pitching. I would have probably said something different last year for pitching, because I thought the Rays pitching was sensational. But I think that this year, it's fair to say that the Yankees have definitely surpassed the Rays. I think the Rays got rid of a lot, and they did not really upgrade. I think the Yankees didn't really have much to upgrade. They did get some pieces that could be very good and could potentially turn out to be really great snags from the offseason, like Cory Kluber and Jameson Taillon. But I think that this is also going to be a test early on to see kind of where the Rays are. Where do they stand, right? Are they still kind of that legitimate team, or are they going to be going up against a really good Yankees team, and are they going to fold? And I think that we'll see early on, and again, I know it'll be early on, so you can't really gauge it a whole lot, but it'll be early on to see what it will be kind of like, and kind of a preview to the AL East, a peek into it, and see what it will be like for the Yankees and the Rays to match up and this, that, and the other. The other thing is, how will the lack of really big-time moves by the Rays, and honestly more loss than gain, affect them in the long run, too? So I'm going to be very curious to see how that is. I'm going to be very curious to see that series, because I think it could be a preview to something big down the road. But also, I'd love to just see a little rematch from the ALDS a year ago. So another series I want to talk about, Indians and White Sox, April 13th to April 15th. Again, this could potentially be an AL Central race. I know the Indians have lost a considerable amount, and they've lost more than they've gained, very similar to the Rays. But let's not forget, the Indians are a pretty solid team across the board. They're able to field a pretty good team for the most part, but the White Sox, they're so good. The White Sox have added so many pieces that it's going to be hard to ignore, in my opinion. I mean, you've got guys that have come on board during the offseason, like Lance Lynn, like Liam Hendricks, like Adam Eaton. You already have guys there like Jose Abreu and Yohan Moncada and Eloy Jimenez and Tim Anderson. The list goes on and on and on, not to mention Lucas Giolito and Dallas Keuchel. I think that this could be a really scary team, not just in the Central, but the entire AL. But the Indians, they could put up a little fight. They did go out and get Franmil Reyes, who has been playing pretty well in spring training. Eddie Rosario was a nice add for them. Ahmad Rosario, he could turn out to be potentially a pretty good player at shortstop for them. But again, I think very similar to the AL East, it's going to be an early test to see where these two teams are. Are the White Sox going to rebound after I think what was a very disappointing season? I think that they should have gone much further than they did last year in the playoffs. I think that they were very underwhelming when we got to that point. And I think that they have a lot to prove. I think especially with the team that they have, the adds that they've made, and with how well that they performed in the regular season last year, I do think that they have a lot to prove. I think that they still need to really let people know and say, hey, we are this really good team that you all perceive us to be. We're not kind of just this glorified team on paper and we don't do anything in the field. I do wonder what Tony La Russa's impact will be early on in the clubhouse and in the team in general. But I am just wondering potentially how it's going to be in the AL Central this year. I think it could be a toss-up in all honesty because the Indians, they could put up a fight. And I definitely think that the White Sox and the Twins, all three, it's going to be very similar to the AL East. It could be potentially a three-way fight in that top-seeded and top part of the division, if you will. But that's a series to definitely watch from April 13th to April 15th. Getting further into April, we actually have a 2 straight weekend series between the Dodgers and the Padres in April 16th to the 18th, and April 22nd to the 25th. 2 straight weekends of what's becoming probably the best and most hyped rivalry in baseball right now. I mean, this is the NL version of the Yankees and the Red Sox, if you ask me. Literally, I think that the Dodgers and the Padres could become the NL counterpart in terms of a rivalry that the Yankees and Red Sox have had for years. And so that's what I'm excited to see, is kind of how early on the tempo is set by both teams. And not to mention, it's going to just be a fight between those two in the NL West the entire season. So we're going to see kind of a preview of what the rest of the season could look like. Will the Dodgers really let the Padres know that there is still that much separation between the two teams? Or are the Padres going to show that, hey, we've evened the playing field a little bit with you all, and we can really hang with you guys even if you have a really good team because we've added a lot also. And so I'm curious to see how the Padres are going to stack up against the Dodgers and how they're going to perform against them. You know, last year in the playoffs, I thought they actually held their own pretty well, and not to mention they didn't have Blake Snell. They didn't have Yu Darvish. And now you kind of equalize things a little bit with getting those really good pitchers. That the hitting, I think, was very similar between the Padres and the Dodgers. I don't think that there was any dissimilarities there. I don't think there was any kind of weird differences or anything that was glaringly just opposite from the other. I think that the pitching was the big component that was very, very different. I think you had really good pitching from the Dodgers. You had good pitching from the Padres, but it just wasn't as deep. Now you've got that deep, really good pitching in their rotation. You've got some really good guys coming out of the bullpen now. You've got yourself a different team. And I think that the Dodgers, they might not really pay attention to that. I think that they're still kind of riding this wave off the World Series. I don't think they know what's coming. And I think the Padres are looking to strike. So I'm really excited for those back-to-back weekend series between the Dodgers and the Padres. And I'm really just excited to see how much of a rivalry is going to be built up by the end of this year. I mean, it's going to be intense, I think. So then getting later on into April, A's and Rays, April 26th to April 29th. The reason why I'm watching this is because two of the lowest payroll teams that are going to match up, but they're two low payroll teams that always build winning teams. And so that's what I do love watching about these two teams, is that they're able to still field winning ball clubs. And even though they don't have these major star-powered players, they're still able to perform. Both teams have lost, I would say, a significant amount. I think that the Athletics have added back somewhat of what they've lost, but I don't think the Rays have done that. So I'm kind of curious to see which team's lack of moves, or better yet, kind of impact of certain players that are no longer with the team. So Blake Snell and Charlie Morton with the Rays. Then you go look at the A's, and Chris Davis is not there anymore. Liam Hendricks is not there anymore. How will the lack of their presence impact both of these teams and affect their play moving forward? Not to mention, it could be a wild card race. I mean, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but if the Rays find themselves kind of the third man in that AL East, or the odd man looking in, or the one team on the outside looking in a little bit, I definitely think that we could see a little potential wild card series between the Braves and the Rays, or the A's and the Rays. And again, same thing with the A's. Who knows what's going to happen in the AL West? I know I'm very critical of the Astros, but who knows? They could field a really good team this year. Guys could bounce back and play better than they did last season, and it could be a totally different AL West. But I don't know. I think that, the Astros are kind of on their way out right now, and I think the A's are still, they reign supreme over the AL West for the most part. So again, another series to pay attention to. But getting now slowly into May, Braves and Blue Jays taking on each other April 30th to May 2nd. And this is very, very far-fetched. I know that. It is way out in left field. It might be even into the parking lot. It's so out there. Maybe a little preview to a World Series matchup. I think that these two teams would be kind of the dark horses in the World Series watch, if you will. I think they're two teams that are further down people's list as to which teams could make the World Series, but they're still on the list. And so I'm curious to see how they stack up against each other. Not to mention, I'm curious to see how this really talented Blue Jays team goes up against other really talented teams in the NL. Can they hold their own, right? Can they compete with NL East teams? I think it's a big test. Not to mention, I'm curious to see how these young stars, Kevin Biggio, Vlad Jr., Bo Bichette, they come back this year and perform. I'm curious to see how Marcus Semien and George Springer perform. Semien has not played well in the spring training so far. But again, it's spring training, and I think spring training is more so of a gauge and kind of a test for younger players, guys that are coming up through the farm system, coming up through the organization and trying to prove themselves. And I think it's more so for the everyday players and the guys that have solidified their spots on the team, kind of just getting your feet wet again and kind of getting your legs underneath you a little bit and getting back into the routine that really not a lot of players have been doing for quite some time, a couple months now. So again, having to get back into that rhythm, not to mention they didn't have a spring training last year, so that's also been kind of a new thing. So that's a series I'm watching as we creep into early May, but as we get into the middle of May, Mets and Braves take on each other May 17th to May 19th. And again, I think this is going to be, like I said, for the Yankees and the Rays, like I said for the Indians and the White Sox, a preview to a battle in the NL East. I mean, this could be one of the most competitive races in baseball, I think, next to probably the Dodgers and the Padres, or at least I'm speculating here. I also want to see how Ozuna fares in a full season. How will Marcelo Zuna build on the year he had last year, with him now being potentially an everyday position player? A lot of reports coming out in the offseason that Marcelo Zuna is ready to get back into the field. He's ready to go back in the outfield. He has won a Gold Glove before, but he's had shoulder problems, and that's affected his throwing, and that's affected his fielding overall. So I'm curious to see how he fares and how he does in a full season, not just being a strict DH. I'm also curious to see about Lindor, how well Lindor plays. I know that he's discussed trying to make a deal with the Mets for a long-term contract extension before April 1st, but let's say that nothing happens and they have to play out this year before they can really get into anything with him after the season. What if Lindor does not pan out the way they thought he would and they wind up still winning, but maybe the Mets say, hey, we're going to move on from you. We're not going to. So it's going to be interesting to see what direction the Mets go in with Lindor, but also does Lindor really put together a good season? Is he going to I obviously think he will do that, but we have no idea. We still have 162 games to play to really see what's going to happen. I also want to see the pitching duels, right? It's going to be two very comparable teams with a mixture of experienced talent on both ends. You've got good pitching on both ends, and you've got young talent. I will say I think the Mets pitching is definitely one tick higher than the Braves, but I still think the Braves pitching can hold its own. Max Fried was one of the best pitchers in baseball last year. Ian Anderson put on a show in the playoffs, one of the best pitchers in the postseason. You add Charlie Morton in the mix, and all of a sudden you've got a brand new rotation. And I know that Jacob deGrom's looked incredible in spring training. Everything I've read in reports have been his fastball velocity is back up to like 99, 100 miles an hour, as if he didn't even miss a beat last year. So I think it's going to be a good series. I would definitely circle that one on my calendar and definitely pay close attention to it. But as we get through the rest of May, the last series that I want to discuss, White Sox and Yankees on May 21st to May 23rd. What I'm looking to see in this one is two heavy-hitting power teams with a lot of offense. They might be two of the best hitting teams in the AL going at it, and I think that could really turn into a slugfest. I will say I'm curious to see how the change in baseballs affects teams like that, right? How much are we going to see maybe a drastic drop-off, maybe a little bit of dip in production from these really high-powered offensive teams like the White Sox, who have, I would say, 3 to 4 guys that can bat well over 300 and that could probably belt 20-plus home runs consistently. Same thing with the Yankees. They've got 4 or 5 guys that can do the same exact thing. The White Sox pitching is a little bit higher up than I would say the Yankees are. That's where the White Sox differentiate themselves. But maybe this is a preview to the ALCS, too. I mean, I would love to see White Sox-Yankees ALCS come October. I think that would be pretty interesting to watch. Again, I think that the White Sox would just barely edge past them because the pitching's a little bit better. Well, we have to see. I mean, if Taillon is healthy this year, he could live up to the expectations that have been set before him, and all of a sudden he's shutting everybody up like myself, who is a little skeptical of him right now, and that is me. I do find him to be a potential liability due to his injury tendencies and how often he's been injured and how often he was injured in Pittsburgh. Cory Kluber, on the other hand, has had his fair share of injuries, but he's proven. He has shown to people that he can be at the top of the pitching game in baseball when he wants to be. He literally was that. Between 2014 and 2018, he was one of the best pitchers in all of baseball. He had 2 Cy Young Award winning seasons. So that should tell you a lot about what Cory Kluber can do. So I'm excited to see the White Sox and Yankees on May 21st to 23rd. I think it's going to be a great showdown. But quite frankly, I think we've got a slew of really good matchups these next couple weeks here as we move into the early part of the season that could really set the tempo early on for the rest of the year. I think that we could see some players and some teams start off hot, maybe cool off quickly. They could start off really cool and then get really hot all of a sudden. So it's an up in the air year, if you will, because again, we are coming off a year where there was no spring training, so that's a big adjustment for a lot of guys. So ultimately, we'll have to see how things fare for these teams, but I'm really excited for these upcoming 3-game series that I think a lot of people should also pay very close attention to. So that'll do it for us in this third segment. As always, thanks again for sticking around, but stay right there because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll dive right into an off-season grading of the AL Central and discuss the grades from the off-season I will give to both each team and the division as a whole, but also make sure you stick around for that because it's going to be a good one. You don't want to go anywhere because we've got one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Bride and I are still with you, and in the previous segment, I jumped into talking about which 3-game series early on in the season to pay close attention to and could have lasting impacts throughout the rest of the season and could also be potentially previews to tight races down the stretch of the season in 2021. But I want to wrap up today's show with a division grading of the off-season moves by the teams in the AL Central and discuss the team's off-season moves, the grades for those moves, and then a grade for the entire division as a whole, like I usually do. I believe this is my last division that I'm going to run through on these off-season gradings because we are slowly getting closer to opening day, which is going to be a great day. I can't wait for it. I know I've sounded like a broken record saying it over and over again, but I'm just really pumped up for that Thursday, April 1 slate of games, and every single team is playing too, so that's even better. So just running through the division like I usually do, Indians, White Sox, Twins, Royals, and Tigers. And I want to jump into the Indians first. They've had some ads, I guess. Ahmed Rosario coming over in that trade with Lindor, as Rosario was with the Mets. Now he's with the Indians. And then Eddie Rosario, who was with the Twins, now coming over to the Indians in free agency. I would say that those were the 2 major pieces that they went out and got. Rosario, Ahmed Rosario, he's an interesting case. I think he's got a lot of potential. You know, kind of a 250, 275 guy. He's got pretty solid speed. He's a good fielder, got a good glove. He's somebody that they could work with. And I don't know if they kind of have this idea that maybe they're getting the next Francisco Lindor, you know, another shortstop that's, you know, got a lot of promise, has a lot of potential. I don't think that he's anywhere near Lindor at all. I mean, Lindor was putting up insane numbers his first season as a major leaguer, and Rosario is not doing that. I do think that he does fill a void for them, obviously at shortstop. I do think it's obviously a downgrade, but I think he could be okay in the long run. But Eddie Rosario, I was actually kind of impressed with this pickup because this Indians team was one of the worst teams hitting-wise from the outfield. I mean, they were one of the worst teams with outfielding hitting all of last year and even the year before. I believe they were one of the lowest OPSs across the board for outfield hitting. So going out and getting a guy like Eddie Rosario, who 2 years ago had a season where he was over 30 home runs and neared 100 RBIs, he's a guy that can put up some serious numbers. He can put up a lot of power. I know that they went out and signed Ben Gamble, who came over from the Brewers in a minor league deal, and I think that he could eventually get moved up. I mean, Gamble is good. He's proven himself. I think he's a better fielder than he is a hitter, but I think that he can provide good hitting. But Eddie Rosario is a good pickup for them. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a game changer. I do think they could still compete for a playoff position. I think that their pitching can take them a much further than people think. You know, Shane Bieber's still coming off an insane season, and I think that he's just getting better and better, and he's just getting started. Ultimately, I'm going to have to give them a C-. I'm just not completely sold on all the moves they made. And again, I feel like with losing Francisco Lindor, losing Carlos Carrasco, those were two big losses for them, right? I mean, Carrasco was one of their main guys, one of their main rotation guys. He was a Cy Young finalist a couple years ago, put up some really good numbers in 2020, put up 2.92 ERA. So he's somebody that's, again, I mean, he fits really well with that Mets team, kind of a back-end starting rotation guy, where if you've got him in that kind of 3-4-5 spot, I mean, that's a really good 3-4-5 pitcher, if you ask me. So I'm going to give them a C- because I think Eddie Rosario, that move kind of saves them a little bit, but ultimately not a huge fan of their moves. Now, getting into the White Sox, I think the White Sox did a lot of interesting things. Went out, they got Lance Lynn, traded for him immediately, almost within a couple weeks of the season ending. Adam Eaton also bolstering the outfield a little bit, especially defensively. Liam Hendricks really is going to heighten the talent and the ability coming out of the bullpen. I like what they did, because what they did was they diversified their moves. They spread out their moves, and they went after their needs in a variety of ways. They knew they needed starting pitching and veteran starting pitching. They did that. They needed some help defensively in the outfield. They did that. They went out and needed some help in the bullpen. They went out and got that and fixed those issues. And that's what I really like. I always look at these teams that if they go into an offseason and they assess the needs that they have to assess and they need to fill, then I think they're going to have really successful off seasons. And then the following season, you kind of just have to see how it plays out. The White Sox, it was very clear, and I've said this before, when they were in that 3-game wild card series with the Athletics, or not wild card series, but in that 3-game series where they were up against the Athletics in the playoffs, you could tell after the first 2 games, right, you had really good pitching for the most part, and then all of a sudden it just dropped down, right? You've got Lucas Giolito, you had Dallas Keuchel, and then you had Dane Dunning, and Dane Dunning just imploded. And so you needed that third veteran arm to go to in a situation like that, where if you needed a commanding 3-0 lead, you know, you can take losing one game and then having Giolito or having Keuchel or having Lynn back out on the mound. Not to mention, Lynn is a very durable pitcher, and that's what I really like about him, is that he can go for long extended periods in games. I mean, he led all of the major leagues last year in innings pitched with 84. He was one of the few pitchers over 80 innings pitched. So I think that's something also to make note of, because if you need to keep him in for a long extended period of time, that's great. And it gives your bullpen some time to kind of ease up on things. But then once you get into the bullpen, you've got Liam Hendricks coming out, and Hendricks has been one of the best bullpen relievers in the last 2 years of baseball. He has been on a tear. And Adam Eaton, he's not going to be a great hitter, but they don't need great hitting. That's the thing. If they had gone out and gotten more hitting, it would have said, why are you just adding to something you already have? You have Jose Abreu. You have Eloy Jimenez. Yohan Moncada, who, by the way, didn't even have that good of a season last year, batted around 220, 225, and then in 2019 it batted 315, 325 himself. So a guy that's got a lot of potential. And then you've got Tim Anderson, not to mention there. I think that this is a team that people need to pay very, 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 very close attention to, because I think they could do a lot of really big things this year. So I'm going to give them a B+. I think they checked off a lot of boxes. Obviously, if they had gone out and gotten somebody like a Blake Snell and traded for him, probably would have been in the A range, but I'm going to give them a B+, because I think that their moves were still just that good, and I definitely think they can go far in the season this year. So getting into the Twins now, a couple major adds for them. Andrelton Simmons getting picked up in free agency after he spent a couple years with the Angels. You also have Alex Colomé coming over from a cross-division rival in the White Sox. And then you re-sign Nelson Cruz. I'm going to start with the Nelson Cruz re-sign because if they had not done that, that would have been one of the biggest regrets that they would have made. This was a roster, this was a team that had virtually little to no offense. Little to no offense. Nelson Cruz was one of 2 or 3 players in their entire starting 9 that even batted remotely near or above 300, and he was the only one that had somewhat of a decent or substantial OPS last season. I know he's getting older. He only signed to a 1-year, $13 million contract, so they're not really expecting him to be around for the long haul. Quite frankly, I don't either, because, again, he's getting older. But he's still showing that he's productive. And the fact that he re-signed with the Twins is also maybe going to extend his career and his longevity because he can still play the DH. They still have that void filled for them. A lot of other teams, I don't know if they've got that void completely filled. I don't know if they necessarily have that defining player that is associated with them being the DH. Some teams do, some teams don't. And the Twins, they've got that. They've got that box checked off. Now, for Alex Colomé coming into that bullpen, that's huge because they had one of the best bullpens all of last year, ERA-wise, everything. They lost a lot of guys. They lost a ton of guys in free agency. So going out and getting Alex Colomé, I don't think it necessarily erases all of the players that they've lost, but what it does is it at least alleviates some of the pressure on the starting pitching, which I think the starting pitching will be good still. Jose Barrios is still there. You've got Randy Dobnak, who had a surprisingly good season last year, who, a very interesting story about him, and he kind of came out of nowhere, and now he's really put himself on the map, and he's solidified himself as a starter on this Twins team. And you have Kenta Maeda, who's coming off a Cy Young finalist year in the AL in 2020, led the MLB in WHIP at 0.75. And so I think that they're set with the starting pitching. They needed to go out and get that relief pitching. But then Andrelton Simmons, it just is more hitting. He's still a solid bat, great glove over at shortstop. And it'll be interesting to see what they do with Jorge Polanco. If they move him over at second, if they keep him at short, what they do there. But that could be a very interesting middle infield. Polanco a couple of years ago was an all-star, had a pretty solid season. I think he's got a lot of potential, and I think they've done a nice job at surrounding him with other talent like Andrelton Simmons. And I do think I've got, pretty high hopes for the Twins this year. I don't know if they're going to break their streak that they've got going in the playoffs because they are really bad in the playoffs. I don't know what it is. It's like a switch goes from being turned on to being turned off come playoff time, and they fold. And I think that I would say the one thing they should have maybe done is gone out and gotten some sort of real veteran presence that's been there before, that's done that. If they had gone out and gotten Charlie Morton, it'd be a perfect guy to go out and get. Great playoff experience, great playoff pitcher. And I think that, even though Charlie Morton won't go down as one of the best pitchers ever, he'll go down as one of the most talented and most composed postseason pitchers, I would say, of all time, just because of how well he does in game-deciding situations, how well he does in series-deciding situations. And I think that if they'd done that, it would probably be a pretty impressive team. But they still did a lot of good things, I think. I'm giving them a B+, mainly because they went out and got Nelson Cruz and re-signed him, and they also went out and got Alex Colomé. So those are 2 huge, huge, huge moves that they made that I think are going to pay off for them well down the road. Now, getting into the last 2 teams, I'll first start with the Royals. They made a lot of early moves, really throughout the entire offseason. Just a couple highlights. Carlos Santana from the Indians, Greg Holland re-signed, and then they signed Salvador Perez to his extension, 4 years, $82 million. So all in all, I like what the Royals are doing. I think that they're still in this rebuild phase. I would say if I had kind of a rebuild race phase or kind of a gauge as to where each team that's rebuilding is right now, the Royals are very ahead of a lot of other teams that are currently going through rebuilds. You look at the teams like I'm about to mention, the Tigers. You look at teams like the Pirates. You look at these teams that are still kind of the Mariners. They're still kind of figuring things out. I think the Royals are much more ahead of the curve. I think that they're much further along in the process of rebuilding. I don't necessarily think that they're going to be great this year or even next year, but I could see them maybe in 3 or 4 years going back to the playoffs. And then maybe, who knows, we can see a reemergence of the Royals in the mid-2020s like we saw in the mid-2010s with how well they were in 2014 and 2015. Back-to-back World Series appearances and winning in 2015. It's not too shabby if you ask me. But these moves, I don't think are necessarily game changers. Greg Holland is a really nice move. I liked having him get re-signed with them because he does provide good pitching, and they have a lot of young pitching, and so they're going to need some veteran leadership there. Same thing with Perez. Everything I've ever read, and I mentioned in the first segment, great rapport with all of his pitchers, and I think that's going to do wonders for these young pitchers on this Royals team. And then Santana, he provides not only hitting, but patience at the plate. This Royals team was one of the worst teams in walks and on-base percentage last year, and they're getting a guy that is coming off a year where he led all of the major leagues in walks. And I think that's going to really pay off for them well. I think if they can constantly know that, okay, Santana's up at bat, we can at least hope and assume that he's going to get on base somehow, some way, whatever way that might be. So ultimately, I like having Carlos Santana there. I love Perez coming back. I do like Holland. I wouldn't say moves like getting Andrew Benintendi was big. I don't think getting Michael A. Taylor was big. Michael A. Taylor, I think the reason for him is because they're trying to replace Alex Gordon, who retired in the offseason. Alex Gordon, not a great hitter, but a really, really good fielder. That's exactly what Michael A. Taylor is. And then you look at Andrew Benintendi, he's just been underwhelming. I mean, he's been an underperformer, I think, his entire career that he's been in the major leagues. And so maybe he can get some revitalization and really have kind of the birth of his career in Kansas City, because it clearly was not happening in Boston. So I'm going to give the Royals a C+ on their offseason moves. I liked some, wasn't a fan of some others. They were okay. Early on, I liked them, but as time went on, it kind of fizzled out for me. So the last team, the Tigers, I would say the major ads that they had, I mean, it was pretty quiet offseason in Detroit. Wilson Ramos comes back, but honestly, what's he going to do, right? I think he's well past his prime. I think he's well past his time. I think that he needs to maybe think about retirement. I know I did that segment a couple episodes ago. Maybe he's another guy to potentially think about retiring after this year or the following year. Robbie Grossman, he brings some defense to the outfield. I think he also brings some reassurance that if a guy like Jacoby Jones goes down with an injury, which we saw last year, they've got a guy like Robbie Grossman that can step right into that same spot and fill that void. Jacoby Jones is going to be an interesting one. They also re-signed Jonathan Scoop, which was a good move. They re-signed Heimer Candelario, which I really, really like. I just wonder if Jacoby Jones will be healthy. If he can stay healthy, I think this Tigers team can be a lot better than people think. I'm not saying that they'll be a playoff team, but I think that they could be closer to 500 than what a lot of people think they're going to be at this point in the offseason as we approach into the regular season. I just wonder if they're going to be making the moves that they need to be down the road. I think that having A.J. Hinch at the helm is very wise because he does a lot of great things. I know his reputation has been a little bit tainted right now with what happened in Houston, but quite frankly, he's got a reputation for building winning franchises. He did it in Arizona in his brief time there. He comes to Houston, has kind of a setback year, and then the next couple of years just gets on an absolute roll. And so you do have to wonder, okay, they've got the guy in place that can turn things around for this team. Are the front office management, are the ownership, is all of that going to somehow, some way pull themselves together and say, hey, we're going to make big moves that we need to make? I think one thing's for certain, they need to eventually get Miguel Cabrera off contract and off payroll because he's just eating up so much of their payroll. Now, he has still been semi-productive, but I think that's going to start dropping very soon. I mean, it's already started to dip a little bit. And so I do worry that he's going to be a guy that's continuing to kind of just wither away on the bench and wither away out in the field, and he's not going to really do much for them, and they're ultimately going to potentially, lose a lot of years of trying to rebuild because they don't have the financial backing to go out and make those moves because they're tied up with a long contract with Cabrera. There's nothing you can really do about it right now. But I wouldn't be shocked if they either maybe bottom out of his contract down the road, or maybe they trade him. Who knows? It depends on how much more he wants to play, but he's in his late 30s. He's approaching 40, so I don't imagine many more years out of him. So ultimately, I'm going to have to give the Tigers a D+. Wasn't a huge fan of their moves. I feel like they're, again, kind of a little bit behind the curve, as very different from the Royals in terms of where they are in their rebuild phase. I think the Royals are much further ahead. The Tigers, I think they're just starting, so we'll see how things go. But I'm going to give an overall grade to the AL Central of a B-. I floated with this one a little bit. I thought about a C+, but I'm going to give them a B-, mainly because of what the White Sox did and what the Twins did. I think that they've done moves in the past couple months that have been able to set themselves apart. I think they did things that were going to really, again, build some separation between themselves and other teams. Now, it'll be interesting to see how much separation there is between the White Sox and the Twins, because that's another kind of thing to figure out. But all in all, I'm pretty hopeful for this, these two teams, the Twins and the White Sox. The rest of the division, not sure what to think of it. I think the Indians could be that kind of sleeper third team. But we'll have to see. We're going to have to figure it out because, again, opening day is only a couple days away, folks. So get excited. Make sure you got your popcorn ready on April 1st because there is going to be a boatload of MLB action. But, folks, that's going to wrap it up for us here today. As always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd really appreciate that. And as always, folks, thanks so much for tuning in today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.